Hello and welcome to another conversation in this series of PoSoCoMeS interviews. And my guest today is Daria Khlevnyuk, a sociologist who works at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Daria, hello.
Hi.
And Daria, among many other things, is also one of the co-founders of our working group, PoSoCoMeS. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about her own research and various collective research projects that she's been part of. And then at the end, also talk a little bit about her own motivations and expectations for the group and our upcoming conference. So let's maybe start with your own major research project that you worked on for many years and that you're currently writing a book on, which is about regional museums in Russia that talk about the Stalinist period and specifically the Stalinist repressions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, yeah, so that was a rather big project. A fieldwork contained 15 museums from 7 different regions of Russia. I tried to choose museums from very different regions. So I had some museums from the northern part of Russia, Karelia, from the far east, the Magadan region, the infamous Kolyma that Russian studies people know very well from books of Shalamov, for instance, and the southern part of Russia, the northern Caucasian region, Ingushetia and Kabardino-Balkaria. These are the regions that suffered from mass deportations, from people's deportations during the Second World War, when they were assumed treacherous people. The idea behind this sampling was that regions that suffered from different aspects of the Stalinist terror will have different memories of this terror. I mean, this is a fairly easily understandable idea, and obviously this hypothesis was proven. But I was also interested what are the differences, right? So, for instance, in Karelia and in the Magadan region, these are the regions where the repressive system was also foundational system for the region. So, for instance, the White Sea canal in Karelia was this huge mega project by the Stalin system that also created all the industry alongside. And for Kolyma, the camp system and Dalstroy, which was this huge economic trust that was managing the whole system of camps, was also the type of colonization of the region. And both Karelia and primarily Magadan region, the way that we know them right now is the way they were created by this camps region. So for them, it is both dramatic history, but also myth of foundation for these regions.
And how is that represented in museums?
In museums, we see that, for instance, when these are both memories of trauma and foundation memories, we see that museums struggle with telling this story. They obviously understand that it's a very traumatic history and they mourn their victims and they are trying to tell the sad story of repressions, but also they want to tell the story of how their region thrived during these years. In Magadan, for instance, in the main museum of local lore in Magadan city, for quite a long time, there were 2 museum exhibitions that were dedicated to the same period. One was specifically about the camp system, where you could see the artifacts from the camp, where you could see the memoirs of people, photographs of victims. The whole exhibition was set in dark tones. Black is the main color of the exhibition. And then on the same floor, there's an exhibition about this Dalstroy managing company, which is very different, and it reminds us of museums in other big corporations. So it's like a corporate museum about the successes of this managing company, about the leaders, about about the free workers. And the idea behind it is that this history of Stalin's period for this region is both history of inmates and thus victims, but also of free people who were also working there. And they don't know how to match it, so they just made two different exhibitions that don't talk about each other. Right now, the second one about the Dalstroy is closed for reconstruction, so we'll see what's going to happen, if it's going to be the same or if we'll see some changes.
So what is the relevance of museums anyway? Obviously, there's a big debate internationally about the extent to which museums even really shape or contribute to our understanding of history. If you compare the role that these museums play locally or regionally to, let's say, films or mass culture in general, political speeches, school education, other sources of knowledge or ideas about the past, what is the importance, what is the role that museums play?
That is a very good question. It's great. And the problem is that we can't really measure it, right? I mean, we can't make a survey asking where do you get your information and what information influenced you more, and be absolutely sure that the results we're having are the sort of true results. If a person tells us that this film influenced them or that they primarily read historic books, we're not very sure that this means that this is what shaped their historical knowledge or memory. So it's very difficult to know the same about museums, whether they influence people that much. We understand that specifically in regions, museums are one of the very few cultural institutions. So people usually go there or went at least once. More often than not, they went there as children with their teachers for a guided excursion that they couldn't really get out of. But anyway, they were there. What is more important, at least for Russia, but I'm guessing that it may be the same for many other countries, is that museum curators in the regions are not just museum curators. They are memory activists, memory agents in a broader sense. Oftentimes, they don't only work in the museums, but they have a lot of other memory projects. One of the curators in the Magadan region, for instance, is very well known even outside of region, and he doesn't only own a collection of artifacts from camps and owns a private museum, like very small private exposition, but he also publishes memoirs, he publishes books of memory, he deals with monuments, he does research work on these campsites, and this is quite usual. So museums are just these institutions where these people usually work, but their memory projects go larger, and in a sense, usually museum curators are one of the most prominent memory agents in these regions. So
mhm. Maybe, especially for an international audience, it's important to really stress what is specific about these memory agents in a Russian context, because often internationally, when we talk of memory activists, the idea that we have in mind is of courageous people standing up to sort of dominant state-imposed discourse that wants to preserve silence about past state crimes, etc. And against that, they're kind of championing an independent narrative of history. But in the Russian case, but I think in many other countries as well, it's actually much more complex than that, because these memory agents that you studied, they're not necessarily all about challenging the state discourse.
Yes, absolutely. Memory activists are not necessarily opposed to the state history politics. Secondly, they're not often aware that they have some sort of ideology of sorts. They are more of local historians, and they're trying to make their history popular. They're trying to preserve memory the way they understand memory. So it's a bit different, especially if you go to small towns. You don't often see them as political actors. They just don't really know about it. And this is the interesting part as well. So for me, it was interesting to see what are the memory narratives they are promoting, And what I've been seeing during my fieldwork is that, first of all, these are very different memory narratives, even among those activists who actually know each other. The memory narratives they promote can be different. But what is more important, they don't know each other most of the time, even though they sort of work in the same field, but just in different regions. The whole field of memory activism, even in this field of memory of repressions, is very disengaged with each other, I would say. There are no big networks. There used to be the Memorial Network, for instance, but as of now, it's pretty much broken, and most of these activists work on their own and maybe meet sometimes. Many new activists not even in this network anymore. So that's one thing.
And I think that that's also something that needs to be stressed, because it really represents a historical change, right? Once again, often when we think of memory activists in the post-Soviet sphere, what we think of is the Memorial Society, which was founded in the late 80s, and which really at the beginning did represent a network of people active in all the former Soviet republics who were connected with each other, who did get together to, create a group, and who were extremely critical and deliberately critical of a state narrative, right? And if I understand you correctly, this really has changed. Memorial's own network has, in a sense, thinned out and partly been replaced by some of these museums that are now part of the Association of Memory Museums in Russia.
Partly, yes. Memorial is still a very influential organization, obviously. But yes, what I'm saying is that regional chapters are sort of breaking apart, just altogether, getting smaller. Some of these chapters are now just one person who used to be part of Memorial Society and may even go still to the meetings, like the annual meetings of the Memorial Society, but other than that, is not very connected to the whole narrative, for instance, that the Memorial Society is trying to do. It was a very interesting case in the Perm region, where Perm 36 is situated, and it's very well-known case. It was covered in international media as well when they were moved from the ownership of the activists to the state ownership, to the regional.
We probably have to say that Perm 36 is a prison museum, and was actually, I think, one of the first museum in a former prison colony in provincial Russia.
Yes. The only, or one of the very few museified museums, even on the post-Soviet region in general. So, and is part of the Sites of Consciousness network. So they are also very active and very prominent in the field. The interesting thing was that while it was under the local activists, the people who actually created it, they created a whole network of museums, of history teachers, of activists in the region, in Perm region. And this network would exchange ideas, exchange information. They would do a lot of educational and commemorative acts and programs and so on. And once the museum was stripped away from them, this whole network just broke down. The same history teachers that used to work with their kids, with their school kids, on the topics of memory of repressions, they don't do that anymore. The same museum curators in the smaller towns that used to work on this topic are right now sometimes still doing something, but it's more of inertia than their own projects. So it's very important to have networks, and Russian museums are now lacking in these networks. And we see how in the end this leads to very fragmented landscape of memory, because activists have very different notions of what was happening, what they want to commemorate, and what is sort of the lesson from this period to the present.
So I'd like to ask a comparative question. You've described a very, very complex and in some ways counterintuitive memory and museum landscape in Russia. to what extent is what you're describing peculiar to Russia? Or do you find similar phenomena in, for example, other post-Soviet republics, in other post-socialist countries? I mean, one would think that in countries like Latvia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, museums would be much more kind of dedicated in their negative portrayal of Stalinist terror. Is that the case?
I think that you're right that this is a larger problem, and there's been a lot of research, for instance, in Georgia as well, right? This is one of the most interesting cases because for them, Stalin is also a hero, being a Georgian who managed to rule such a huge country. And these are very interesting studies of the Stalin Museum in his own in the village that he was born in. But I think we could also look at it even on a larger scale. The crisis that we see now, the right turn that has been discussed in memory studies as well. And, there was this interesting section on that in the last Madrid conference of Memory Studies Association. We see that the culture, this global, cosmopolitan, transnational, and transcultural memory culture that we've been writing and reading about for the past 10 years, at least in memory studies, or even longer, it has produced also some backlash, and we see this growth of a competitive memory narratives, right? And this whole memorial war that we see now in the US as well, and this competition of newly awakened, possibly Confederate memory with a sort of more understandable for us in the present memory culture, memory of the Civil War as the war where the good people won, right, and the human rights were defended. We see that there is this crisis of this culture, and what I see in the cases of these museums is, I think, a very similar tendency. This is a tendency to stop and reflect on this traumatic memory culture, on this idea of just talking about difficult past, dark histories, mourning, and all those sort of negative emotions, and trying to figure out whether this is productive even for these regions, or they need to come up with some new mixed narratives that they don't even have language right now. And in not having language, I think they're museum curators in Russian regions faced the same problems as other countries, even Western countries, but also, of course, post-socialist countries as well.
So speaking of language, in addition to your own fieldwork about museums, you also participated in a large-scale quantitative study with other sociologists, where you tried to look at different attitudes towards how to deal with the past throughout Russia on a national level, but also on a regional level. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right, that was a very big and sort of risky and, in a way, a weird project for the current memory studies, I guess. Memory studies don't work with surveys that much right now, and we did it with Greg Yudin, Dmitry Rogozin, and Anna Ipatova. It's a mixed team. Me and Greg were working primarily on the concepts and ideas, and Anna and Dmitry, being the brilliant methodology team, created the survey that we conducted in the end. The idea was to look at memory not as an image or some sort of just narrative, but to look at it as a social and political process, and ask people not what they know about repressions or what they think about Stalin and repressions, but ask them what they think about different tactics of dealing with this past. For instance, whether the story of repression should even be talked about or should be silenced so that no one gets nervous and everybody lives in the blissful ignorance of the whole memory. We created this complex survey study with dilemmas that tested these different attitudes towards tactics. And we conducted it first on the all-Russian scale, so it was an all-Russian study, and then in several regions, in 8 regions, if I remember correctly. And the idea was to see whether there are models, like strategies that people tend to prefer. We call these models by the names of different countries, evoking stories of how different countries dealt with their difficult past. And that was the idea, to start sort of a discussion inside Russia about different paths. As you've been writing and you've been talking, Russia is very much stuck on the German model, which is very different, not very helpful, and is actually misleading in a lot of senses for Russia. But everybody just knows it and discusses it. And
Actually, most people don't even know it.
True. I don't know it very well, it's true. And it leads to the feeling of some sort of uniqueness, which is, of course, in part very true. Russian case is unique, but it's also not unique if we start comparing Russian memory of difficult past with other memories. And we, as memory studies people, we know that. So we also tried to create not just an academic project, but also sort of an activism project, in a sense, that will start a discussion in Russian public sphere about different models, and maybe thinking about Russian case in context of other countries, not just Germany.
Right. So at the end of this conversation, I want to spend some time on our working group, since you're one of the co-founders and not only a very active member, but also you're coordinating the program committee for the upcoming PoSoCoMeS conference in September 2020. So could you say a few words about what motivated you to be involved in this group, and what your expectations and hopes are?
So my approach to memory studies and to my own case was also a lot of comparative stuff, right? When I was discussing my project, my museum project, in the very beginning, I was debating whether I should go to just one museum and study it from, bottom up and up to bottom, and just know everything about this museum, or whether I want a comparative study. And I went with a comparative study that has its limitations, of course. I don't know for sure everything that happened to museums where I studied, but I have a general understanding of tendencies, right? These are the limitations. But I think comparative studies are very important now, and specifically cross-national comparative studies, right? Overcoming the methodological nationalism, so to speak, as Beck put it. I think Memory Studies Association is a great venue to discuss different cases, but as it grows bigger and bigger, we see that it also becomes a bit difficult, and we need to maybe go a bit more regional. And I think the great thing about our group is that we're sort of going more regional, but we're not really going regional. We're starting to discuss specific problems. So we understand that post-Soviet countries face very similar questions and very similar problems, and we're sort of focused on that. That also gets us to some regional limitations, but the idea is still to be comparative and to see our own studies in a context, right? So my Russian study in a larger context, in a context of post-socialist countries, for instance, well, not just them. In any case, I think what we aim for in this group, or at least I hope you're on the same page here, is a platform for people from different countries studying different issues and different cases to be able to talk about it and to see some similarities or differences, maybe create some groups of authors, create some new work, and to sort of contextualize what they're doing. And this was the aim of our conference as well. And I hope everyone who watches it will come and register for our conference and tune in to our YouTubes and Zooms. The idea was to create sessions not on the basis of countries, but on the basis of problems and topics. So we tried to put people from different countries and study in different countries, but studying similar problems in the same sessions, in contrast to just putting people from same countries in the same session. So our conference is sort of showcasing our approach. And this is an approach of comparison and trying to talk about bigger issues using our small but interesting cases.
It sounds like an obvious but brilliant idea, because so few people are really doing this. And let's hope it works.
Hopefully.
All right. Thank you very much. And we hope to see everyone online in September.
Yes.
Goodbye.